Welcome, early American literature friends. This video is a discussion of letter 3 of Letters from an American Farmer by J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur. You see de Crevecoeur here. He lived from 1735 to 1813. In 1755, when he was 19-20 years old, he was born in Caen, in Normandy, in sort of northwestern France. If you know that area, it's just about 10 miles away from like Normandy Beach in that area. When he's 19 or 20 years old, he comes to North America, to what was still then New France and the French colonies, what would eventually become Canada, but also like upstate New York in that area, very northern New York. He is involved in the French and Indian War, which is in the 1750s. He works as a land surveyor. After the French lose the French and Indian War, he then takes that opportunity to come to New York. He essentially crosses the border, but close to where he was already working, comes to New York. You see here, he becomes a citizen of British North America, and in 1770 he gets married. He and his wife have at least 2 children. He bought a farm in Chester, New York. It's for us now about an hour and a half northwest of New York City, in Orange County, New York. He called it Pine Hill Farm, and that seems to be where he planned to spend the rest of his life. That was his plan. But then in 1779, as the American Revolution really gets going, his father is ill. He gets word that his father, still in France, is ill. He travels to New York City, but with the American Revolution going on, the British still held New York City. History and historical records suggest that he was, if he had any clear leanings towards one side or the other, he was maybe a loyalist, still loyal to the British government, but was kind of hanging back and waiting to see how the war played out. He is imprisoned by the British, though, as an American spy. There was some suspicion that he was a double agent. He is held for a little while by the British government, and because of that, he finally, you see here, he was in prison as an American spy for 3 months. Eventually, though, he's able to sail for Britain. His ship wrecks off the coast of Ireland, but he finally, in 1780, makes it to his father's estate. He and his father settle things. He gets the land and the money that he wants from his father, gets all that resolved. But it is also very clearly, after the death of his father, he returns to London, and it is there that he publishes this book that he has written while he was living on his farm at Pine Hill in New York. He publishes in English Letters from an American Farmer. It makes him an immediate celebrity, because with the American Revolution going on, there is this immense interest and thirst for knowledge about the Americas, both in England, but essentially in all of Western Europe, and to understand like how these American people are different, how they're not just colonists. He quickly became a literary success. It turned him into a celebrity. He was the first writer to describe to Europeans, employing many American English terms, the life on the American frontier, and to explore the concept of the American dream. And that's what you get a lot of in letter 3, is his sort of exploration and explanation of his notion of the American dream, portraying American society as characterized by the principles of equal opportunity and self-determination. This sort of everybody can become what they want to be and determine their own destiny and their own fate. And that really transitions us into letter 3 from an American Farmer. You can see that he goes on. He lives until 1813. He returns to France, and he lives. He returns to the United States in, let me check. I want to give you the exact date. In 1783, after the Revolution, he returns to the United States, and he makes the very sad discovery that his farm had been burned during an attack by Native Americans. His wife had died during the years that he was gone, and his children were living with relatives, with friends and relatives. So he gathers his children. He is made the French diplomat, the French consul to the United States into New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. He works as a diplomat for a few years. There's even a town in Vermont named for him. But in 1790, he returns to Paris, and he never comes back to the United States. He returns to France for good with his children, right as the French Revolution is sort of reaching its height. He lives in Paris for a few years and then returns to Normandy, where he was originally from, to Caen and around that area. He writes another book. It's much less popular, published in 1801, and he lives the rest of his life from the 1790s to 1813 in Normandy, where he had been born. But his book, Letters from an American Farmer, which is constructed, he creates this imaginary person, Farmer John, who is writing these letters, and he uses Farmer John to sort of describe different aspects of America, different geographical parts of it, but also different ideas and different aspects of both the place and the sort of people who live there. Letter 3, like I said, has become the most famous of those letters. There's a historical marker at Pine Hill Farm where his farm was. You can see that right there. Letter 3, though, is really his exploration of, it starts off with that first sentence: I wish I could be acquainted with the feelings and thoughts which must agitate the heart and present themselves to the mind of an enlightened Englishman when he first lands on this continent. The whole rest of letter number 3 is really him explaining that idea. The feelings and thoughts which much agitate the heart and present themselves to the mind. This sort of, if an Englishman lands here for the first time and just starts traveling through the countryside, what would he learn? What would he see? All of letter 3 is really this sort of exploration of that. He must greatly rejoice that he lived at a time to see this fair country discovered and settled, when he views the chain of settlements which embellish these extended shores. And you have to remember, in his sort of sense of discovered and settled and wild, woody, and uncultivated, one of the problematic aspects, the troubling aspects of de Crevecoeur is his sort of dismissal of the Native Americans. He acknowledges them as these people who live beyond the frontiers of the country, but his sense that America was this sort of just wild, uncivilized place with no towns or anything like that is really off base, obviously, because for him, America exists as this sort of 200-mile strip along the East Coast that is the settled part, because he is thinking about European civilization and European colonization. Here he sees the industry of his native country displayed in a new manner, traces in their works the embryos of all arts and sciences and ingenuity which flourish in Europe. And so he sees the United States as this sort of baby version of Europe, in his sense of like the industry and arts and sciences, because they are just developing here in this way that they've been developing for hundreds and hundreds of years of Europe. But they have more space in place to grow and flourish, is the sort of counterbalance of that, his sense that is balanced by the freedom of the space for it to grow. He has arrived on a new continent, a modern society. It is not composed, as in Europe, of great lords who possess everything and of a herd of people who have nothing. This is one of de Crevecoeur's central ideas, is that in Europe there's this huge gap between these few people, the wealthy, the aristocrats who have everything, and this would certainly have been true in the 1700s when de Crevecoeur is writing. This big gap, though, between the few aristocrats who have everything and the peasants, the common people who have nothing. And the gap between them is this uncrossable big gap. And one of de Crevecoeur's central divides is that gap between people who have not, the few who have almost everything, and the poor who have very little. That gap, there is no such gap in America, and everybody is much closer to the middle. Nobody's really wealthy, nobody's really poor. The gap is just not that big in America. Here, no aristocratical families, no courts, no kings, no bishops, no ecclesiastical dominion. He's arguing there's not all these layers to society. The rich and poor are not so far removed from each other. There's not that gap. Some few towns accepted, we are tillers of the earth. And this is where he gets, most people in America are farmers. And he sees that as the sort of perfect, that job is the perfect example of American life. Because land, if you want land, you can have land, and then you can work the land and develop your own wealth. Like, you can take your own property and develop wealth from it. And everybody has an equal opportunity to that. So he sees that farming as the sort of representative of the opportunities of America. We are all animated with the spirit of an industry which is unfettered and unrestrained, because each person works for himself. not for some wealthy landowner, not for some aristocrat who inherited their land. Everybody can work for themselves. A pleasing uniformity of decent competence appears throughout our habitations. The meanest of our log houses is a dry and comfortable habitation. He's talking about just the basic living conditions for people. They're not living in these poor peasant shacks like poor peasants who farm in Scotland or England or Europe or something like that. Everybody, again, because there's trees everywhere, everybody can cut them down, mill them, build their own log cabin, and it's nicer than what you might find in Europe. Lawyer or merchant are the fairest titles our towns afford, and those would all be people living on the coast. But he's saying the highest titles anybody can have are people in the cities who are wealthy merchants, wealthy traders, or wealthy lawyers. There's not among them an esquire save the unlettered magistrate. There he sees a parson as simple as his flock, a farmer who does not riot on the labors of others. We have no princes for whom we toil, starve and bleed. Here man is free as he ought to be. Who can tell how far it extends? Who can tell the millions of men whom it will feed and contain? For no European foot has yet traveled half the extent of this mighty continent. That's not really relevant to his argument here about the land, but it is an interesting historical moment because it's still the late 1700s as he is writing this, and no one knew then. The European colonists had no idea how far west the continent extended, and you have to remember at this point the English colonies extended about 200 miles to the west at their very furthest, roughly around the Appalachian Mountains, or the Great Lakes, if you want to think about it that way. So he is explaining that nobody has any sense of how far the continent goes and how long it will take people to settle the whole continent, but it's certainly not settled now, so land is free for everybody to come and claim. The next wish of this traveler, back to the first sentence where he started, this traveler who's just arrived, will be to know whence came all these people. They're a mixture of English, Scotch, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, and Swedes. From this promiscuous breed, that race now called Americans have arisen. And so he is saying, like, it's all this mixture of these people who came to this country from all these different European countries for all these different reasons. There never was a people situated as they are who with so ungrateful a soil have done more in so short a time. So he's saying these people came to this country, started tilling and working the soil, and turned it into farmland quicker than anybody could imagine. And then the next paragraph, in this great American asylum, and that is perhaps that sense that America is an asylum. That is his central sense. If you understand the word asylum to have two meanings. Asylum can mean both refuge, like escape from persecution. You can seek asylum. People come to this country even now as asylum seekers. You can apply for that. So asylum is this sort of refuge or escape from persecution, and you're taken in and protected and given security and safety. But asylum also very clearly means like a place where mentally ill people are housed and incarcerated. This sort of the insane asylum or something like that. And he sees America as both of those. The sort of rejects of Europe have escaped here, but also those people are rejects because Europe had no place for them, no land for them to work, those kinds of things. And so America is this sort of double-edged sword. It's an asylum of both meanings, a place of refuge, but also a place for the sort of cast-offs and people who didn't fit into European society. The poor of Europe have by some means met together, and in consequence of various causes, 2/3 of them had no country. And by that he means their country had no place for them, and they had no reason to be allegiant to it. Can that man call England or any other kingdom his country, a country that had no bread for him, whose fields procured him no harvest? That's it. He was doing no good in that country, and that country had nothing to provide for him. Urged by a variety of motives, here they came. Again, there's the asylum idea. Everything has tended to regenerate them, new laws, a new mode of living, a new social system. Here they are become men. In Europe, they were as so many useless plants, wanting vegetative mold and refreshing showers. Formerly, they were not numbered in any civil lists of their country. That means they did not own land, they couldn't vote or participate in government, except those in the poor. So that means like they would have been listed in poverty, in debt, possibly even going to debtor's prison. He is giving you a nod here to especially places like Georgia, where people, prisoners were sent, but they were often prisoners because they had been in debtor's prison. Here they rank as citizens. And so here, they were just cast-offs and even in debtor's prison in Europe, but here they're full citizens who have the opportunity to make whatever they want to be. What attachment, next paragraph, what attachment can a poor European immigrant have for a country where he had nothing? And so he says, like, people here are Americans, and they are become a new breed of people because they have really no allegiance to Europe, and Europe, which could provide nothing for them. What they should be allegiant to and what they feel attached to is this place, which gave them opportunity. The knowledge of language, the love of a few kindred as poor as himself, were the only cords that tied him. There's nothing really holding him except for his family and his language in Europe. What then is the American, this new man? And that's an important idea, that the American is a new man. He's not just, a refugee or a colonist. He's a new person. He's a new breed of person. He's either European or the descendant of Europeans, hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. I could point you to a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son was married to a French woman. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners. And so you leave behind all these sort of attachments and ideas you have from Europe and are transformed. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater, the sort of motherland. Here individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men. And this is where, melted into a new race of men, you can see Crevecoeur inventing the sort of concept of America as this melting pot, where wherever you came from here, that is melted away and you're becoming an American, this new breed of person. The Americans ought therefore to love this country much better than that wherein either he or his forefathers were born. Here the rewards of his industry follow with equal steps the progress of his labor. And so, like, rewards, you can work hard and you get the fruits of your labor versus just working for a wealthy aristocrat or landowner in Europe. And so because of that, you should be loyal to this country and throw away your old allegiances. You should be melted. The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. He must therefore entertain new ideas and form new opinions. From involuntary idleness, servile dependency, penury, and useless labor, he has passed to toils of a very different nature, rewarded by ample subsistence. This is an American. That he is passed into a new existence, and he is therefore a new person. And then he gets in, the next section gets into specific geography, and he says, like I said, de Crevecoeur understands America as this strip along the East Coast that is about 200 miles wide. And he says, British America is divided into many provinces, forming a large association scattered along a coast 1,500 miles extant, so that means 1,500 miles north to south, and about 200 miles wide. So you got 1,500 miles north to south and 200 miles east and west. And he understands that 200 miles east to west as having three sections. The coast and the areas around the coast are that first 50 miles, and then a 100-mile middle section that he understands as farms and large farms, small farms, but where that's mostly inhabited by farms and farmers. And then the furthest west 50 miles, which is the frontier, and inhabited by the frontierspeople people who are constantly pushing west. They exist on the fringes of society, and the frontier itself is this sort of fringe of society. And so he says, for instance, it is natural to conceive that those who live near the sea must be very different from those who live in the woods. So he's saying the people who live in the city is very different from the people who live on the frontier in the woods. And the intermediate space, the middle ground of farming, will afford a separate and different class. Men are like plants. The goodness and flavor of the fruit proceeds from the peculiar soil and exposition in which they grow. So he's saying, like, depending on where you are in that, you're going to grow to be a slightly different people. Those who live near the sea feed more on fish than on flesh. This renders them more bold and enterprising. This leads them to neglect the confined occupations of the land, like farming. They see and converse with a variety of people. The sea inspires them with a love of traffic, like this sort of trading and traffic that comes, all trade then would have happened on ships, so you would have to live near a port. And so living near the sea, the people who live in that 50 miles along the coast are people who live in cities. Those are really where the only cities were, ports like New York City or Charleston or Savannah, Boston, Philadelphia, those areas. And so that, like, those people live on the coast. Those who inhabit the middle settlements, those people live on the coast, those are this distinctive 50-mile group of people who are interested in trade and what he calls traffic, a love of traffic. Those who inhabit the middle settlements, by far the most numerous, must be very different. The simple cultivation of the earth purifies them. And so now he's talking about that middle 100 miles, the American farmers, those group of people. As free men, they will be litigious. As citizens, it is easy to imagine they will carefully read the newspapers. As farmers, they will be careful and anxious. And then the third group of people, if you recede still farther from the sea, you will come into more modern settlements. They exhibit the same strong lineaments and a ruder appearance. And so he's saying the frontier is like the farmers, but this sort of ruder, more basic, more modern settlements. What he means there is newer, like fresher, still being settled. Now we arrive near the great woods, near the last inhabited districts. The frontier is what he's talking about, and the frontiersmen, what he calls the backwoods and backwoodsmen. There, men seem to be placed still farther beyond the reach of government, and he is interested in that idea that one of the things that makes America good is that the government is not confining. His sense that the government is this sort of representation of citizens, and he sort of criticizes the people who want to live on the frontier because he says even the sort of light, loose government of America is too much for these people, which is one of the reasons they flee to the frontier, because they are wild men who just can't be civilized in any way. The reunion, how can it pervade every corner as if they were driven there by misfortune, necessity of being, desire of acquiring large tracts of land, idleness, frequent want of economy, ancient debts? The reunion of such people does not afford a very pleasant spectacle. He's talking about frontiers people, and what drives people to the frontier is all this mix of bad behaviors, and so it's not a very pleasant sight to see. He calls it the few magistrates they have there, in general better than the rest. They are often in a perfect state of war. These men appear to be no better than carnivorous animals of a superior rank. But the Crevecoeur makes this important point. He who would wish to see America in its proper light and have a true idea of its feeble beginnings and barbarous rudiments must visit our extended line of frontiers where the last settlers dwell, and where they may see the first labors of settlement, the mode of clearing the earth, in all their different appearances, where men are left wholly dependent. He is saying if you want to see how America started, 150 years ago, you go to the frontier now and you see these people carving civilization out of the wilderness, or what he sees as the wilderness, and you can have a sense of what it looked like 150 years ago right on the coast. If you want to see how America was originally settled, well, you can see it still being settled. It's just 200 miles further west now. And he says, in that space, prosperity will polish some, vice and law will drive off the rest, who uniting again with others like themselves will recede still farther. He's describing how the frontier keeps moving and keeps shifting further and further west. And he is saying, you give it a generation or two, and what was the frontier will become settled land. And the people who have settled it then either have to civilize themselves and fit into civilization, or they have to keep moving with the frontier. To like maintain that sort of wildness and unsettledness. They're going to have to move. 40 years ago, his smiling country was thus inhabited. It is now purged. A general decency of manners prevails throughout, and such has been the fate of our best countries. Again, he's saying you give it 40 years, and that's how long it takes to like settle the frontier and move it further west. Again, like one generation or so of people. He says, Europeans submit insensibly to these great powers. Not only Americans in general, but either Pennsylvanians, Virginians, or provincials under some other name. The inhabitants of Canada, Massachusetts, the middle provinces, the southern ones will be as different as their climates. He's talking about how even within this sort of 1,500-mile stretch, there's a great diversity of people, depending on the climate, depending on the soil, depending on how people can make a living, those kinds of things. And then that next paragraph starts off, as I have endeavored to show you how Europeans become Americans, it may not be disagreeable to show you how likewise the various Christian sects introduced wear out, and how religious indifference becomes prevalent. This is one of his central ideas, is religious indifference, and his notion that one of the biggest divides in European culture is people of different variations of Christianity, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, and different kinds of Protestantism, like being Baptist or Episcopalians or those kinds of things. And he says here there is a religious indifference, and he explains, beginning with that paragraph that starts off, as I have endeavored to show you how Europeans become Americans. He says, if the sectaries are not settled close together, if they are mixed with other denominations, their zeal will cool for want of fuel. Their sort of like religious, intensity will cool down because of want of fuel, and it will be extinguished in a little time. And so he's saying people come to this country and they don't have a local church to go to. They don't have something to maintain their sort of strict religious indifference, and their neighbor may be a different religion, and their neighbors, their next three neighbors may be all different religions. And he says, Let us suppose you and I to be traveling. We observe that in this house to the right lives a Catholic who prays to God as he has been taught. His next neighbor may be a good, honest, plotting German Lutheran, so the Protestant, who addresses himself to the same God agreeably to the modes he has been educated in. Next to him lives a seceder, the most enthusiastic of all sectaries, one who does not, like, that means somebody who does not practice in a formal church, a seceder. His zeal is hot and fiery, but separated from it, he is from others of the same complexion. He has no congregation. He has no church to go to, nobody to like maintain his strict discipline. He talks about. Next lives a low Dutchman who implicitly believes the rules laid down by the Synod of Dort. And so what de Crevecoeur is saying is, by the rules of simple geography and your neighbors, like if you don't have a church to go to maintain these specific differences in terms of congregations and sects of Christianity, then that sort of religious intensity dies down. And he said that's like there is no national religion in the American colonies, and so because of that, one of the cause of a lot of trouble and strife in Europe, the sort of religious difference that has died down and not fueled in this country. Each of these people instruct their children as well as they can, but these instructions are feeble compared to those which are given to the youth of the poorest classes of Europe. Their children will therefore grow up less zealous, more indifferent, again that religious indifference, indifferent in matters of religion than their parents. The Quakers, he says, this is the exception. The Quakers are the only people who retain a fondness for their own mode of worship, for be they ever so far separated, they hold a sort of communion. This is largely true. Like if you go to a place like Kentucky or Western Pennsylvania, even now the Quakers maintain their areas and settlements, and they live together and try to remain somewhat separate from society. But he argues this is true even then, but they are really the exception of this rule in the United States. Thus all sects are mixed as well as nations. Thus religious indifference, again, he comes back to religious indifference is imperceptibly disseminated from one end to the continent of the other, north to south, which is at present one of the strongest characteristics of the Americans. That sort of religious indifference is one of the things that distinguishes the Americans from the Europeans. But to return to our back settlers, back to the frontier, back to that like furthest west 50 miles, I must tell you there is something in the proximity of the woods that is very singular, and he uses the word singular to mean like distinctive and unique. He says, by living in or near the woods, their actions are regulated by the wildness of the neighborhood. The deer often come to eat their grains, the wolves to destroy their sheep. This surrounding hostility immediately puts the gun into their hands. They watch those animals, they kill some, and this is the progress. Once hunters, farewell to the plow. The chase renders them ferocious, gloomy, and unsociable. A hunter wants no neighbor. And so de Crevecoeur distinguishes the farmer from the hunter, because the hunter is like out on the frontier, and living on the frontier, he has to hunt to protect his crops, to protect his livestock, those kinds of things. But de Crevecoeur argues that farming is this sort of distinctive mode of like regular work, and is this sort of honorable work, while hunting is this sort of, farmers want to be in a community to help each other. Hunters don't want to be in a community because they don't want the competition, de Crevecoeur says. And so he says that makes one of the defining characteristics of back settlers, frontiersmen, is not wanting to be a part of a community. They want to be out on the frontier hunting by themselves. This new mode of life brings along with it a new set of manners, which I cannot easily describe. Their tender minds have nothing else to contemplate but the example of their parents. Like them, they grow up a mongrel breed, half civilized, half savage. He says people on the frontier, half civilized, half savage, except nature stamps in them some constitutional propensities. And so, and de Crevecoeur also says, because they have nowhere to go to church, one of the other things, because on the frontier there are no churches, there's no civilization, no towns yet, they haven't been developed. He says they don't go to church on Sundays. So again, that one of the ties that binds people together in community, especially back then, this going to Sunday church, they don't have that. And so they are wild in the sense that they have no community and don't want to be ruled by community or follow community example of like decency and regular behavior and those kinds of things. And then he says, is it then surprising to see men thus situated, immersed in great and heavy labors, degenerate a little? It is rather a wonder the effect is not more diffusive. Thus, our bad people are those who are half cultivators, half hunters. So they do a little farming, a little hunting. And the worst of them are those who have degenerated altogether into the hunting state. They adopt the moroseness and ferocity of the native without his mildness or even his industry at home. Hunting is but a licentious, idle life, between the toil of the chase, the idleness of repose, or the indulgence of inebriation. And he says, like, if you live this hunting lifestyle on the frontier, you're either, ferociously hunting, idly resting from the hunt, or like getting drunk, drinking moonshine or something like that. We should rather begin with converting our back settlers, and now if I dare mention the name of religion, its sweet accents will be lost in the immensity of these woods. And so he is saying the frontier is both this place where this sort of outcasts and outlaws of society go, but also being there makes you an outcast and an outlaw because of the necessity of how you're forced to live in that sort of proximity to the wilderness. And then he swings you back. Europe contains hardly any other distinction between lords and tenants. This fair country alone is settled by freeholders, people who are not lords and not tenants, but freeholders who hold their land freely. This is the thought which you have taught me to cherish, our difference from Europe. Had our forefathers remained there, they would have only crowded it and perhaps prolonged those convulsions which had shook it for so long. And so he makes this comparison between if these people had stayed in Europe, they would have just made it even more crowded and caused the kinds of problems that were then causing the French Revolution and these sort of revolutions in Europe. They would have made it even worse. But instead, they are transplanted here like plants, and they flourish in this new American soil, is the metaphor that he uses. Colonists are therefore entitled to the consideration due to the most useful subjects. 100 families barely existing in some parts of Scotland will here in 6 years cause an annual exportation of 10,000 bushels of wheat. So he's saying, like, if these people had stayed in Scotland, they would have been largely useless. You bring them here, and not only are they thriving, but they're like generating enough food to export back to Scotland to help those people in Scotland. It is here, it's one of the most famous sentences in all of letter 3. It is here that the idle may be employed, the useless become useful, the poor become rich. But by riches I do not mean gold and silver. We have little of those metals. I mean a better sort of wealth. Cleared lands, cattle, good houses, good clothes, and an increase of people to enjoy them. And he is saying that is the wealth that America can provide you, is this sort of freedom to generate your own wealth. But by that wealth, it is land, cattle, good houses, good clothes. There is no wonder that this country has so many charms. A traveler in Europe becomes a stranger as soon as he quits his own kingdom. Like you go from France to Spain, or Denmark to Germany or something like that. He becomes a stranger as soon as he quits his own kingdom, but it is otherwise here. We know, properly speaking, no strangers. This is every person's country. The variety of our soil, situations, climate, government, and produce has something which must please everybody. He sees happiness and prosperity in all places disseminated. He meets with hospitality, kindness, and plenty everywhere. He beholds hardly any poor. He seldom hears of punishments and executions, and he wonders at the elegance of our towns, those miracles of industry and freedom. And so he is saying, we're back to that first sentence and that sort of European who first lands here. This is what he would see, is all this sort of thriving, not necessarily wealth, like de Crevecoeur says, in terms of gold and silver, but people who are thriving and industrious and enjoying the sort of freedom that America can provide. After a foreigner from any part of Europe has arrived and become a citizen, let him devoutly listen to the voice of our great parent. And by great parent, he means like the country, the land. Welcome to my shores, distressed Europeans. If thou wilt work, and this is de Crevecoeur's, one of de Crevecoeur's, you can't get around this. He says everybody is free to have whatever they want to have, but they have to work. If thou wilt work, I have bread for thee. If thou wilt be honest, sober, and industrious, again, industrious like work, I have greater rewards. I will give thee fields to feed thy children, to feed and clothe thee, a comfortable fireside to sit by, and tell thy children by what means thou hast prospered. In that sort of prosperity of like the freedom to make your own wealth and not have to give it to some landowner. I will also provide for thy progeny, and to every good man this ought to be the most holy, the most powerful, the most earnest wish he can possibly form. Go thou and work and till, again, back to working and specifically tilling, being a farmer, thou shalt prosper, provided thou be just, grateful, and industrious. And this is de Crevecoeur's, this is where de Crevecoeur works his way to, is everything is, the great promise of America is everything available, but you have to come here and work. But work is important to him, because he says people worked in Europe, of course, but your work went to whoever owned the land that you lived on. And so work wasn't really valued there, because you couldn't work for yourself in the way that you can if you come to America. You can have land, and again, this is why farming is the sort of central job that you can have for him, because there your work and your industriousness, how hard and how smart you work, there is this direct relationship between how hard and how smart you work and being able to sort of enjoy the fruits of your labor, which aren't then given away or owed to the landowner or the aristocrat or something like that. That is de Crevecoeur's. One of the things that is interesting about letter 3 and that has made it so famous is you have this mixture of sort of religious freedom and his simple description of the sort of 1,500 miles by 200 miles of basic geography and his sort of 3 distinctions of that geography: the coast, the middle settlements where the farmers are, and then the frontier where the backwoodsmen are. So you get this sort of mix of philosophy and geography and religion, and political ideas about America being this melting pot, and to come here you have to melt in and become an American, and and part of that melting is forgetting your strict religious ideals and embracing that kind of religious indifference that he describes. And so there's a bunch of, you can see why this book was so appealing to Europeans, because it gives them this mix of information about how these people are different people and what it's like when you come here. This book, in some sense, although it has all these religious and philosophical and political ideas in it, on some level it is also just like almost like a tour guide to what you would see if you come to the Americas, especially if you read other letters. Letter 9 is the other famous one, and it is about Charleston, South Carolina, which at that point was the wealthiest city in North America. And so the book functions both as this like tour guide, or sort of travel guide, but also this sort of philosophical and political guide. And so you get that mix of basic geography, like I said, that mix of geography and religion and politics and philosophy and all those kinds of things. I hope that helps you understand letter 3, which, because it is this mix, it is one of the more complicated things we're going to read. So I hope this helps you go through letter 3 and pick out some of the most important and significant ideas, especially, again, his sense of America is this asylum, America is this melting pot. Hope y'all are doing well. Please be in touch if you have any questions.